Ladies and gentlemen, it's a delight to be with you here today. If you cannot hear me, please ask somebody to signify so that they can get the message to me so that we can rectify that situation here. I'm beholden to Rusi for not only this meeting, but I'm beholden not only to Rusi for this meeting and the good work that you do on defense studies in Canada and elsewhere, but for your international connections. And not least in the local scene was the fact that precursors of yours had the good sense to lay an Uplands Golf Club, which was a Rusi project. And I think it dates to about 1910, something like that. And that was my first field of battle. And I've been golfing ever since. In and out of sand traps. I've learned a lot about ballistics. I've learned a lot about diversionary warfare, and I've also learned a lot about misinformation. All of these things golfers have at their great disposal. When I was a student at King's College London in the Institute of Commonwealth Studies with my dear friend Jim Boutillier, who was my classmate, I went to Rusi's library, which was near Whitehall Palace, and it had the most wonderful collection of old Victorian books, including their proceedings. And I was particularly interested in what they had to offer in those days, because in the 1870s, a couple of brothers by the name of Colomb, C-O-L-O-M-B, one became a vice admiral and wrote much more than he ever should have. He was once called Column and a Half, because his stories in the Times went on, and nobody could ever understand them after the first paragraph. His brother was Royal Marines Artillery and became an exponent and champion of shore power and the defense of fortifications and harbors. And of course, this was a tension that was going on in the Royal Navy, particularly in the 1870s and after, and led to all sorts of developments in field artillery and shore artillery and garrison artillery. In fact, some of the first forces authorized by Canada and sent to this beloved part of the Dominion were in garrison shore artillery. And of course, later on, the Royal Engineers come out and put in sea water defenses of mines. And about the time that the mastery of Esquimalt Harbor had been done in terms of seaborne capabilities and shore-based defense, a chap called Jackie Fisher said, "We don't need these anymore. Apart from various constabulary duties, some surveying matters and surveillance, we're going to concentrate our fleet on Hong Kong," which is where they really were needed, because the Russo-Japanese War was coming up over the horizon, and besides which, the ships by this time were bigger, better, and faster, and could easily deploy to Esquimalt. The United States was no problem to us in terms of a potential aggressor, so better to leave Esquimalt to float on its own, so to speak, and concentrate the forces where they were best needed. They did so similarly in Gibraltar, and Malta becomes a strong base for a fleet a small fleet, a cruiser fleet that could be dispatched as required. And another one was based on Devonport. So this was the new strategy: scrap the gunboats, get rid of those that were not fit to fight, weren't fast enough to run away. And this was the Jackie Fisher mode of operation. He was greatly hated in Victoria. We had been under the protective guise of the Royal Navy for even before the Oregon Treaty of 1848, going back to 1810 and what happened at the mouth of the Columbia, right through to the San Juan Island crisis, browbeating the Indians of the coast when they were in engaged in piracies and murders. I told that story in Gunboat Frontier. It's still the book that's most in demand. There's not a week that doesn't go by that I don't get some call from some irate person said, well, did they really send HMS Devastation up to the west coast to shell the villages, destroy the canoes, and terrorize the people? That's told in chapter 7 of Gunboat Frontier. That's the book with staying power, and it keeps coming back. It keeps coming back. It won't go away. British power does not go away in the local context. It keeps coming back. I was very intrigued when I read that in the year 1888, 2 companies of a regiment, a Canadian regiment, boarded a HMCS ship called the Caroline and went up to the mouth of the Skeena River to put down an Indian rising there. Canadian troops on a British warship putting down a Tsimshian Indian rising. Now you factor in all this today, and then you look at the current circumstances that are going on in Canada's public policy, which are absolutely small change in comparison to what we were dealing with 100 and 125 years ago. Well, this is a legacy that's not going to go away. I'm keeping my head down as much as I can. I'm going to be testifying in court about the use of shells against the villages at Hesquiat and the hanging of Indians who had been caught in trials at Hesquiat. This is not going to go away. I have strong opinions on this. I wrote a book called Pax Britannica to demonstrate the role of the Royal Navy across the world in the year from 1815 to 1914, to explain the role that the Navy had in all sorts of humanitarian actions, putting down the slave trade, supporting missionaries and teachers, engaging in archaeological enterprises, dispatching bishops to New Zealand and other remote locations, helping people when they got caught in volcanoes or earthquakes or fires, and not least establishing British law and order, which I still maintain is the essence of what we have in Canada as our legal arrangements. So all of these things derive from sea power. And Canada is the creation of sea power. It was sea power that brought the Royal Navy here, that changed the nature of Quebec's politics, that subsequently protected Quebec against American attack, which defended Canada in the War of 1812, was engaged in the reprisals and protection of the Hudson Bay Company in this part of the world, and by the 49th parallel finally being established in 1814, by the power finally being established here in 1846, the whole question of Canada had been sealed under the guise of the protection of a power that was far across the seas. My point, ladies and gentlemen, is that the Anglo-British alliance and the role of sea power in the history of our history is tremendous. It's invaluable, and it needs to be kept alive. And I've been trying to do my best to make sure that this is the case. But you know, I do find a lot of Brits disparaged by Canadians because, oh, that was empire and we're no longer empire. I leave that to you for your consideration. I mentioned Jackie Fisher. What a fascinating character. What an un-English admiral. What an un-English admiral. Born in Ceylon, entered the Navy, forlorn, impoverished, sponsored by Lady Wilmot Horton, who happened to know a captain in the Royal Navy. Jackie was admitted to the Royal Navy under those circumstances and volunteered as a volunteer first class, which meant that he was destined for the quarterdeck. Did outstanding boat work in the China campaign. became acting sub-lieutenant, then a lieutenant, and before long, his energy, his vitality, his ideas begin to rub against those who are not quite sure who this unusual creature is. But in any case, he rubs shoulder to shoulder with many of the sub-lieutenants and the lieutenants whose fathers were aristocrats. Jackie was a meritocrat. He owed nothing to his birth. He, in fact, his father had been in a Highland regiment and was a a coffee plantation operator in Ceylon. But they had very little money, so Jackie was only able to thrive and to rise on the basis of his own wit and his own guile. He was an exhibitionist. He made sure that other people noticed him, that seniors noticed him, that he would do things that would bring attention to himself. It wasn't that he disparaged his fellow naval officers and admirals in the waiting, but he was one of those persons who was a thruster. Now, it just so happens that Winston Churchill was the thruster par excellence. And so, in this combination of these titans at the Admiral, we have two extraordinary characters who are, locked in destiny, and they're the same kinds of people. Let me bring the Jackie Fisher story up to date to at least to 1914. He loved weaponry. He was keen on mines. He went to Vernon, which was the school for mines and underwater warfare. He was able to convince them that they needed a torpedo school, and he becomes the first of the instructors of torpedoes. He sees the introduction of the locomotive, that is to see self-propelling torpedo, not one that was on the end of a spar, as had been used during the American Civil War. He sees the torpedo as the weapon of the future. Now, until the submarine was developed, torpedoes could be fired and were fired from warships. But then, to put that in a combination with a U-boat or a submarine, he thought that this was going to be the absolute great future of naval operations. And even though he was the champion of the dreadnought and the battle cruisers that came thereafter, he was even already under the absolute conviction that the U-boat, or I should say the British submarine, would be the best of the means of extending its power. This, of course, led to the question of the fuel supply for submarines. Winston, who by this time was at the Admiralty, and I'll get to that in a minute, Winston said, okay, we need a secure oil supply, and he put Jackie in charge of a royal commission for the oil supply. To convince a nation based upon coal, right, whether in Wales or Derbyshire or Scotland or Yorkshire, wherever, Durham, to think about oil that would be brought in ships from Persia was almost impossible to think about. And Jackie said, well, look at it this way. We can have the storage tanks here, and we're on the seas, we're going to have a continuous supply of oil coming our way for use in our warships. Now, they had to flesh this out with the people up in Scotland who were producing oil through shale coal, but they were able to fix that up. And they brought in the guy who was the lead, Detterding is his name, who's the leader of what becomes the Shell Oil Company, don't you know? British Petroleum is nowadays, still making lots of money out of war and warships. But this was the great alliance. And so convincing was Jackie in his appraisal of the importance of oil-fired ships for the future that Winston got into the business of making his own deal with the Persians, and the Admiralty had 51% of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. That gave a continuous supply for the Royal Navy, but not least, of course, it gave fatally, I suppose one could say, maybe not so fatally, a British foothold in the Middle East. Marion Kent wrote a wonderful book about Fisher and the search for oil and its relationship to the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. I commend it to you. From Jackie's torpedoes and his submarines, he had several commissions at sea to complete to rise in the service. He needed sea time. He was appointed C&C, North America West Indies Station, was in and out of Bermuda, was there in 1898 when his opposite, Admiral Sampson, William Sampson, U.S. Navy, was just finishing browbeating the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. So Jackie gave him a party on the 4th of July of that year. Now, Jackie was very loquacious, talked all the time, chatter, stories, incidents, commanding the stage. William Sampson was the opposite, very, very quiet, sat there. And after Fisher had finished his speech of commendation, Admiral Sampson stood up. Said it was a fine old chicken that hatched this new egg. And that was how the eagle of the United States was born. Dominance of the Caribbean, and they could keep German gunboats out there as required. The British didn't have to worry about the Caribbean, which was one of their backwaters anyway. Also, the United States was going to have extreme power in the Far East, where the Anglo-Japanese arrangements were of interest. The Great Alliance was established there. It was renewed twice, and so by 1911, we had security in the Far East unlike we'd never had before. All of this, of course, would change, and the whole reversal would occur after the First World War, and the United States and Canada would vote against the renewal of the Anglo-Japanese alliance. This was a huge geopolitical shift. Now, Jackie loved his submarines, and he loved his relationship with King Edward VII. Now, Edward VII was a very portly fellow, and when Jackie was building ships down in Portsmouth, he asked the king to come down and have a look at the submarine that was being established there. And the Queen was very unsure about this. She said, you might get His Majesty down that shaft, but I worry about him coming back out. A damned un-English weapon was what Sir Arthur Wilson once called the submarine. But Arthur Balfour, who was the brightest stick in British political and government circles, saw the merits of what Jackie was doing, and far before many of the other cabinet ministers were there. Balfour said, yes, we've got to have submarines. And he saw submarines as port defense capability, that they would be a shield, they would be the guardians of the approaches to the various places all the way around the coast, so that there could not be a German invasion. And you'll remember there was a chap called Sir John French, Army Field Marshal. He was of the opinion that the Germans would invade. They would come by land, they would occupy the UK, and it would be game over. But Balfour, backing Fisher, made sure that the U-boats were put in place, and also coastal shore flotillas to provide protection there. We come to the 4th of August of 1914. All the king's ships were at sea. There had recently been the largest collection of ships together in a great flotilla of English glory, British glory, on the waters. And after that breakup, or when the proceedings were all finished, the sail-bys had occurred, the band music had floated away and ended, the ships went to sea in the darkness. They all went over to Portland Harbor and they bedded down for the night, and then they went to their war stations. And the Grand Fleet, as it was now called, it had previously been called the Home Fleet, was sent to its northern bastion in a faraway cluster of rocks with very little whiskey to hand called Scapa Flow, which Jackie Fisher always claimed was his design and his discovery, but that's nonsense. That was another Jackie Fisher bravado. The Hydrographic Office had discovered this place, but it was 740 miles away from the German coast. Think about the steaming time that would be required to get even into a concentration against the German fleet, which would come off from the Jade and Wilhelmshaven on the other shore. It was a remote location. Comes October of 1814, and lo and behold, a number of U-boats, particularly Wegener and U-9, begins to pop shots at 3 old cruisers that are doing duty in the 14s off the coast of Holland. One is shot and sinks. The second one stops to take on survivors. It is taken down by a torpedo. The third one stops to take on survivors from the other 2. It too is shot. 3 of the old Cressies or Bacchante class disappeared that very day to the shots of Wegener and the U-9. Across on the other side, when he's continuing his patrol, Wegener goes to Aberdeen, and off of Aberdeen, he spots a cruiser called HMS Hawk. He sinks her. There's 4 cruisers shot within a short period of time by 1 U-boat. Now, the justice is that the U-9 is eventually sliced in 2 by HMS Dreadnought, and Wegener dies. He goes to the deep on that occasion. But think of the damage being done. Furthermore, another dreadnought called the Audacious, and she had been most recently built. She was lost to a mine off the coast of the UK. So within this space of 6 weeks, we have this disaster of what's going on in the North Sea. What does Jellicoe do, who's now stationed with the Home Fleet as Commander-in-Chief at Scapa Flow? He says, we got to get out of here. What happens if U-9 or its equivalent comes into Scapa Flow, and here we are as sitting ducks? The Grand Fleet, the crown jewels, Winston called them. So they beat their retreat. They go up to the west coast of Scotland and then to the west coast of Ireland, far enough away from the range, what they thought would be the range of a German U-boat, to bivouac and think things through until they could establish a means of defense and mobility. A couple of bright sparks, one Roger Keyes and Reginald Tyrwhitt, who had been based on Harwich on the east side of England, had the more aggressive Nelsonian spirit because the Royal Navy was being forced into this, we better get into this cave and close our heads routine. We need some action. So new expeditions were taken over to the east coast. The Dogger Bank expedition is one of these, with Beatty, who's commanding the battle cruisers, comes to the aid of these just in time. So they begin to take the offensive. And Jackie hits on this idea, we've got to get control of the Baltic. The Baltic is going to be the next battleground. If we can control the Baltic, we can seal off the German ports, we can blockade their trade, we can land troops as required. This will give us the opportunity of an aggressive position because by this time the whole Western Front had been established right to the British coast, right to the French coast from Switzerland. That was the Western Front had been established. And Jackie and Winston at the Admiralty were now thinking about mobility of force and using what best they could. Well, the Kaiser heard about this idea that they would be able to drop an army in on the coast of Pomerania. He said, that's very well, all very well. He says, we'll send the Berlin police out and arrest them. We'll send the Berlin police out there and arrest them. Now, meanwhile, two other things are beginning to occur. First of all, the Germans are sending their Zeppelins and beginning a terror from the air, even into London, which is finally authorized by the Kaiser. This war from the air was the first of the aerial terrorist attacks in the history of war, as far as I've been able to determine. Winston at the Admiralty was put in charge of the air defenses of the kingdom. And so they were scratching their heads as to what they might be able to do about this. They proposed such things as dirigibles that they could hang up in the sky to provide a fence against the attackers. They talked about various air patrols. They talked about anti-aircraft guns. Radar was not even considered at this point in time. But by and large, they were rather ill-defended against the attacks. And there were some terrible things that happened in that air attack. Also, the second thing that they were now having to consider and worry about was the fact that the German cruisers were coming across. And they attacked Whitby. And they shelled Scarborough. And they shelled Harwich. There's a wonderful book called The Empty Street by Holbrook. She was living in Scarborough at the time, and she described the civil distrust and disarray of these English people who had been living in this peace and security. After all, the Royal Navy, hadn't it, promised their security forever? Hadn't the school kids at the Sunday school been donating to the Navy League? Weren't they all, in one way or another, conscious, as the Navy had been telling them for years, that they could sleep safely in their beds? And all of a sudden, the shelling and the power from the air of terrorism was now besetting them. I'm going to shift now to a couple of the battles that Winston gets involved with. The German Navy was sending in its heavy howitzers, the Krupp guns. These were the decisive instrument of the Second World War. They were pounding the outer skirts of Belgium's capital, and particularly the town of Antwerp. Now, Antwerp's equivalent to London, but on the other side. It's the key to trade and the key to the future. The howitzers were coming ever closer. And at a famous meeting that occurred in London, Kitchener, Sir Edward Grey, the famous foreign secretary, one of his underlings, thought about, well, it's time to call in Winston to see what the Navy can do. So Winston was already on his way over to the continent to do some actions of what becomes known as the Dunkirk Circus. That is to say, the coming and going of Winston and his supporters. Winston had established the naval brigades, right? A naval division. The Royal Marines had been taken into the Army operational activity. There were so many people had joined the Navy that there were an additional number of people who were happily willing to go into a naval division. Winston's ideas, well, we'll send the 4 divisions over and prop up Antwerp and save the day. We've got to keep the Belgians in this war, for heaven's sake. If we lose the Belgians, maybe the Dutch are going to be next, but the Dutch are playing that neutral game that they were so good at in those days. In short, the Dunkirk circus begins to work itself in action. And with the authorization and support of Kitchener, of Sir Edward Grey, of the other chap from the Foreign Office, and Winston's agreement, he's sent back on the train. He has his own destroyer, the Adventurer, that's taking him back and forth as his personal taxi to the shore there at Dunkirk. He, by this time, has arranged for all sorts of armored personnel carriers. Rolls-Royces, don't you know? They're mounted guns. And there was a Commander Sampson, who was the air supporter. He was running the Naval Air Service there. And they had a small operation there, various planes of observation and attack. And they were also using Zeppelins, British Zeppelins, for attacking German fields. So they're working on this project, and it's a form of hit and run. Winston, this is like fighting against the Mahdi, you know. Well, let's put up a diversionary force. We'll blow up a few bombs over here, and the Germans will come over to see what's going on, and then we'll go to another place. Winston was having the greatest time. He loved this. I think this would make a great little book. It was called Winston's Little War. I've even got a title for it, Winston's Little War. But I'll tell you that the documents on this are furtive, hard to find. We've got a few papers by Sampson that Captain Roscoe edited for the Naval Record Society, but very little else. I think this was Winston running things out of his back pocket. In any event, there are famous descriptions of what Winston was like when he arrived in Antwerp. Now, it was chaos in Antwerp. The Belgians didn't know what they were doing. There were traffic jams in the middle of the city. And Winston arrives, and he's dressed in the officer uniform of the Trinity House, which is the famous navigation of the Thames River boys. And he gets out his sword, and he's directing traffic, clearing traffic. And then he meets with the King of the Belgians and with their army officers, and they begin to establish what they think is a workable defense against the Krupp guns and the coming of the Kriegsmarine, of the German army. But it doesn't work. And he is forced to come home. He said to Kitchener, you know, make me a lieutenant governor, lieutenant general, make me a lieutenant general, and I'll provide the proper defense of Belgium that will keep Belgium and Antwerp and Belgium in the war. Well, back in the cabinet, people like Asquith, who was a bit square-headed, thought, this guy is absolutely mad. We would have to vault this lieutenant of Oxford Hussars up 7 different ranks in order to make him a lieutenant governor. So this lieutenant general. So this is not going to work. The press were full of scurrilous activities in regards to Winston and the Dunkirk circus. Not least, of course, was the press, who said, what is the First Lord of the Admiralty, who's running our Navy, doing over there on the Belgian mainland, in Belgium, trying to mount a major land defense of that place? What's he doing there? He has no right to do that. He's got to be back looking after the affairs of the Navy at home. All of these things begin to mount up on Winston. There's another thing. Before Jackie Fisher comes into power, Prince Louis of Battenberg, who's German extraction, is being pointed out that because he's German, we've got to get rid of him. Lord Haldane, who was the Minister of War, who'd gone to a German university, he was pulled from his position as well. He wanted to go to the Admiralty, but didn't get it. Then we have the problems of the Battle of Coronel and the Falkland Islands, which brings Jackie back into the Admiralty full-time. and it's his show. And I think most of you are familiar with that particular detail, but it showed the utility of the fast battle cruisers. It also directed and showed Jackie's willingness to take chances and do things very, very quickly. It's the greatest sea fight in the First World War at sea. All the other episodes were furtive. There were engagements, guns were fired, there was lots of engagement, but nothing in which German ships were sunk, as were the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and two others in that famous episode of the Battle of the Falkland Islands. It proved the utility of the battle cruiser because there was no other heavily gunned ship that could compete with the battle cruiser. Let's come back to the North Sea, and I'll talk about Jutland, and then I'll wind things up because we're getting on here in time. Fisher, like Admiral Nelson, had always said that the parade ground is where the battle should be fought. And it was always understood that the North Sea would be the natural place for an Anglo-German war. All the activities that had gone on in the Mediterranean, which had been the great cockpit of empires, was now set aside because of the rise of the German fleet. Admiral Tirpitz had put in his tremendous shipbuilding plans, beginning in 1899 and accelerating over the next 15 years. He was like Jackie Fisher, he was a shipbuilder, and he could get what he wanted. And Kaiser Wilhelm II was keenly interested in sea power. He'd read Mahan. He'd had a German translation put in every wardroom of every German ship. He was all for doing a battle with the English for the supremacy of the seas, to maintain an empire overseas in competition with the French and with the Germans. But on the other hand, he could also say that he wanted peace with England, and he said, well, between England controlling all the seas and Germany controlling all the lands, it looked like a pretty equitable arrangement. So here's what the kind of thing that we're dealing with. 1902 is the beginning of Captain Watson's reports from Berlin about the rise of the Imperial German Navy, the Kriegsmarine. And after that, increasingly, the British begin to shake in their boots, and Fisher and Churchill begin a counter-campaign to outbuild. And so by the time the war occurs, or breaks out, I should say, in August of 1914, the British have a very large margin. They even have more submarines than the Germans. The Germans only had 29 operational submarines at the beginning of the First World War. But they built those very, very quickly. As I said, Scapa Flow is the base of operations. The battle cruisers are sent up to Cromarty so that they can be closer for actions out in the North Sea. The Admiralty's communications and decoding system has been described as heroic. The actions of Room 40 make for the most wonderful reading. But it was the use of information, then as now, which is the real thing. The information could come in, but how is it to be used, and how is it to be prioritized? And the other thing, which was really a problem, was that the commanders on the spot, at sea, didn't exchange information very, very well. And Beatty was extraordinarily slow in passing his messages to Jellicoe, who was his senior officer, right? 7 minutes transpired between one warning and when it ought to have been received. Now, you can blame the stenographers, perhaps, and the coxswains who were sending the messages, but it was just a shambles. If they had spent so much time on ship handling and keeping station and following the great grand battle orders that John Jellicoe had put in place, they ought to have spent more time in just the practicing of the messages. But here was the problem of culture. And Andrew Gordon talks about this in The Rules of the Game. They weren't used to doing this. The tradition of Nelson was to engage the enemy more closely and to have independent action when required. Anybody can break the rules and should break the rules as was required. Personality enters the story again. David Beatty, who's one of the fascinating characters of this whole saga, is of an independent mindset. John Jellicoe is a slave to customary actions and the rules. So you've got two people who are so different of opinion. In any event, it's intercepted at the Admiralty that the Germans intend to send a fleet to sea. This is latest May 1916. The British send their battleships in good time to meet them off of Jutland, the coast of Jutland, and the battle cruisers come up from Cromarty and Forsyth. And there's the big encounter. It goes on in 4 stages that you're all very familiar with: the encounter, the return, the onslaught of the guns, the heavy firing on the battle cruisers. Beatty's ship is put out of commission. He transfers his command to a destroyer. His vessel runs for home and protection. And Jellicoe, as Beatty once said, well, you know, the Grand Fleet never had any splashes of water on its deck. They were never involved in the action. The heavy stuff went on with the battle cruisers. So a great enmity began to develop between Beatty on the one hand and Jellicoe on the other. And I tell this story in the book. And I also learned about it from doing my double biography of Arthur Marder and Captain Stephen Roskell, the famous historian dreadnoughts, because it goes to the wives of these great admirals. And Lady Jellicoe, who was the great defender of her husband, who she thought that he had been victimized by Beatty, was of the opinion that Beatty was not fit to lie in the vault of St. Paul's Cathedral, where her husband, Lord Jellicoe, had been buried about a year before. She wrote to the chapter of the Cathedral of St. Paul's after the decision was made, and she says, "Isn't it a shame how the Church, which should give such compassionate support to those who are grieving, should in fact do the very opposite?" In other words, to read between the lines, that this war between those who followed Beatty and those who followed Jellicoe was going to continue for some very, very long time. As I've explained in the book, Beatty was Winston's man. Jellicoe was Fisher's man. Jackie had wiggled things around in such a way that when the war came, Jellicoe would go to Scapa Flow to head up the sea, the great Grand Fleet. He didn't want it. He sent, on his train trip north, he sent various telegrams back saying, "I really don't want this, besides which I'm not prepared for it. The fleet is not prepared for my instructions. And what about my predecessor, Sir George Callahan, who's already trained everybody and they love him so much?" Winston declines this. He refuses to accept Jellicoe and Jellicoe's claims to be relieved of this tremendous responsibility. But Jellicoe does rise to the occasion as best he can. But he's a person, as many are in high places, who gathers everything to himself, keeps the secrets, does not share information, worries himself to death, becomes depressed. He's sitting at his desk. He gets a tremendous case of hemorrhoids. He needs medical protection, medical supervision, medical intervention, and he's finally relieved for command. And of course, from failure in one position, well, if it's failure or inability to take a commanding position after the Battle of Jutland, he's vaulted up into the position of First Sea Lord. And it's there, of course, that he has to deal with none other than Sir David Beatty, who by this time is now made Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, don't you know? At this stage in time, the U-boat peril is immediately upon the British, and Jellicoe refuses to adopt convoys because his argument is, and he'd always refused convoys, because his argument was that the great battleships in the Grand Fleet needed escort destroyers. Like my HMCS Haida, thank you very much. She was built as an escort destroyer. You take those ships away, you leave the great ships vulnerable. This was Jellicoe's argument. So you couldn't take any of them away to protect merchant shipping. But in any event, after some goading, some political intervention, David Lloyd George, that guy who always claimed so much, said it was his doing, that he walked over to the Admiralty, and by the time he got across Horse Guards, they'd already changed their position. And immediately, convoys were instituted. And lo and behold, ships went safely in and out of harbor on their peaceful progressions, and this turned the war. As Jellicoe said at the time, they were within weeks in the United Kingdom of starvation. The convoys were able to save the scene. There was never a great battle thereafter, and we then come really back to the end of the story. Once Jackie is out of the Admiralty, the dust of the Dardanelles is settled, the oil question has been resolved, and so forth. He disappears into the position, so to speak. At one time, Winston had gone to command a regiment on the Western Front, and on the 6th of March of 1916, he'd come back just at the time when Parliament was discussing the Admiralty question, and he barged in on the discussion, and he said, "We've got to bring back Fisher." And everybody said at that particular point in time, "Winston, you're mad. We don't need Jackie here, and we don't need you here either." And so ended Winston's war. Winston, as the supreme historian, always had the last word. And that went on right through, especially in 1930, when Reginald Bacon, who wrote the official biography of Jackie Fisher, I have it on my shelves, he wrote this adulatory description of Jackie Fisher and the role that he had played. And Winston said, "No, these things are not true, you know. It was such and such who made that decision, not Jackie Fisher." And always in the back of Winston's mind was, how was he going to save himself from all the prosecution of this failed war that he had prosecuted as First Sea Lord? How was he to defend himself against the Dardanelles campaign and the Gallipoli that had followed thereafter? How was it that in this possession of this immense instrument, the Grand Fleet, the crown jewels, he called it, how come it was that they had had to fight this defensive war in which there had only been one sensational victory, and that was at the Falkland Islands and after some losses there. How was it that this great instrument of war had been rusting at its moorings most of the time without success? Well, out on the Western Front, the bodies had been churning against the barbed wire. Wasn't there something else that could be done, Winston said? But they never had a plan. They never had a plan for this. Nothing could be done. Mention was made earlier of the tank, which was Winston's innovation. He was also keen on air power. He wasn't keen on any innovation. He didn't have the technical knowledge to get these things done, but he was an ideas man, and he was able to get other people to think about it. I love the idea of having a Rolls-Royce armored car. I wish I had one in Victoria. It would be kind of fun to drive around Beach Drive with one of those things. I mean, it might scare a few people. Yeah. I want to read, if I can find it, the Admiralty's statement to the second Baron Fisher of Kilverston about Jackie at the Admiralty. And with this, I will close the story. The extraordinary services which your father rendered during his long and distinguished career in the Royal Navy, both in the Navy itself and in administration offices on shore, are too well known to be recounted here. There is no part in the multitudinous activities of modern sea service in which his influence has not been felt. The nation has been fortunate in having at its disposal, during the greatest period of naval development and progress the world has seen, Lord Fisher's unrivaled qualities of untiring zeal, brilliant genius, and wholehearted devotion. His remarkable abilities were displayed alike in the technical development of the fleet and all its appurtenances, in the training and education of the personnel of the Royal Navy, and in the strategical disposition of the sea forces of the country, both in preparation for and in actual operations of war. And 3 successive sovereigns and their ministers have enjoyed the benefit of his counsels during one of the most crucial and eventful periods of the history of this realm. His loss is irreparable, but their lordships are glad that he lived to see the triumphant conclusion of his labors in the surrender of the German fleet and the successful issue of the late war. My lords desired me to express to you their profound sympathy with you and with the rest of his family in their bereavement, which is indeed shared not only by the Royal Navy, but by the Empire. So that was the Admiralty's statement in conclusion about Jackie Fisher. As to Winston, he of course would have another war to fight, and the message was sent around to the fleet in very early 1939, September. Winston is back. And that's the story of Winston Churchill in the Second World War, which has been written about in many places and still deserves to be retold. So thank you very much. I hope I haven't gone on too long.
Questions, please. Barry.
Thank you, Barry, for a great talk. I'm just wondering, I know Fisher died in 1919 or 1920, I'm not really sure, but I was just wondering if he had any thoughts on the abrogation of the Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty and the ramifications that would bring upon, British strategic concerns in the Pacific.
Yes, thank you for that, Shankar. I mentioned this only tangentially. He had been CNC North America and West Indies Station up and through 1899. Then he was posted to the Mediterranean, where he got a great lot of attention. That was the senior administrative appointment afloat. And the revolution that was occurring in the Mediterranean was profound and very important, and that's how he got the political attention. And comes from that his desire for concentration of forces. And he, out of this comes his argument of scrapping the small ships that are too small to fight and too slow to run away. 1902, I think it is. Is that Jim, right, Jim? 1902 is the Anglo-Japanese alliance. It's a fascinating story. The rise of Russia, Imperial Russia, as a Pacific power, which had been going on since the 1850s, was now manifest by the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The incredible action of the Russians to send their fleet from the Baltic to the east coast to the flank of East Asia is an extraordinary story. It also involves the French, because the Russians were thinking about going into a place called Cameron Bay. Cameron Bay? Is that Cameron Bay? And there is a French base. And my God, if the French were giving succor to the Russians, this would present a further problem and further complication. These were not things that Jackie had opinions on. These were Foreign Office results that came in consequence of this concentration, first in the Mediterranean and then in the North Sea. And Jackie used to say that, the Admiralty always, or the Navy always knows better than the Foreign Office about foreign affairs. And the reason they did that was because they had ships everywhere. And they also had people like Sir Cyprian Bridge, who was the Director of Naval Intelligence. He was born in Newfoundland, incidentally. He was a parson's son. He'd been out here in gunboats, but he was a very astute writer on naval affairs as well. But anyway, he was of the opinion, and Sir George Clark and other defense specialists were of the opinion, that if they could get Japan on side with the United Kingdom, this would free up resources for dealing with things elsewhere. Now, Shankar, it was a defensive alliance only. And it was not until, I think, the second renewal of this, when it became a little tougher or a little more specific, in which the Brits and the Japanese were locked together in a close alliance. The Japanese sent destroyers into the Mediterranean in the First World War to engage in operations there as allies to the Royal Navy. So this is all part of this background. Fisher, let's understand this. He's a materialist man. He's interested in hardware. He's interested in propulsion, gun firing, distances, ranging, how far a torpedo will go, how far the guns of a battle cruiser can fire. He works out this calculation as an example, that if a German torpedo can run through the water for so many yards at such and such a speed, a British battle cruiser must stay out of that range. So the guns of the Invincible class are designed to be operational at a distance farther than the length that the torpedo of that age can go through the water. This is the kind of world he's operating in, right? So he's not engaged in the diplomatic front. That's Sir Edward Grey, who incidentally runs the Foreign Office all by himself, it seems. So I hope that answers your question. But Jackie was into the hardware. He's a front end guy. He's a sharp end guy. He's a materialist. Okay. Yes, Jim.
Thank you so much, Barry. Churchillian. A delight.
Thank you.
To listen to.
You. There was a very interesting little piece by John Terrain many years ago about the First World War, the Battle of Trenches. And one of the principal observations is that we have to remind ourselves that the moment that the troops went over the top, the commanders lost all grasp of what was actually happening in the battlefield. That it was the woeful inadequacy of communications that had we had two-way phones of some sort, it would have revolutionized the course of the battle. And I think that that's one of the really interesting issues, that we have these developments in terms of propulsion, in terms of gunnery direction, submarines, but the fleet communications is woefully inadequate, compounded, of course, by the failure of many of the commanders at Jutland, for example, to actually send information, as you quite rightly suggest, in a prompt and accurate way, because many of the messages that came in were misleading for poor John Jellicoe. But to have a fleet spread over such a huge distance must have put enormous challenges in terms of decision making for someone like John. I'd be interested in your views.
Thank you for the comments and kind words, and thank you for the question. Jellicoe worked very hard on the Grand Fleet battle orders. After all, if you're in foggy weather, visibility is down. You've got smoke coming across the horizon from the firing, and on the day of Jutland, the 31st of May, 1916, there was a great deal of smoke coming down across the horizon from the gunfire, so it was very hard to see. Now, the Grand Fleet battle orders, as I understand it, had several purposes. One was so that ships could keep station. Secondly, if certain flags went up, they would know how to do it in turn together, that they would avoid collisions. There had been a number of cases in Royal Navy history in which admirals had collided. There was one famous classic case that everybody has heard about probably. And so these Grand Fleet battle orders were designed to prevent intership collisions. And so that determined the mode of action. The Germans were one step ahead of the Brits in this. They did, on two occasions, Scheer did a 180. He flipped the whole, he did a whole reversal of the fleet. The Brits had never attempted that sort of thing, or if they had, they didn't give an exercise of it at the time. But you're absolutely true, right, Jim, that they were locked into this position of intership communication and maintaining their station. And so the commanders were very poor at sending out signals. They'd not had enough experience under fire. Please remember, this is the first great battle at sea since 1805. All right? This is the first great battle at sea since 1805. It was all very well for Lord Nelson to say, engage the enemy more closely, or to go on about no captain can do any wrong if he goes alongside the ship of the enemy. Those were all right in those days, but the Navy, the officers of 1916 were imbued with that tradition. They were imbued with that tradition. The Germans came over in a great sweep. Beatties went after them, and instead of taking shots at the respective German ships in line, they all fired on the last ship in the line, the old Blucher. The Blucher was the worst one that they could possibly have taken action against, because she was the oldest, the ugliest, and the least lethal. They put heavy fire into the sailets, which was well worth sinking, but she was able to find her way home, because there was better fire control on board that ship, and there was better compartmentalization on board that ship. So heads did roll after that particular episode, but there was we're fighting here culture. This is a culture change between the old days of fighting sail, which I absolutely adore, the Patrick O'Brien stuff of this world, and then we have the hard-headed stuff of what Beatty and Jellicoe are doing out there in the North Sea. It's tremendous stuff. Finally, to say this, it's easy for a historian to be the great judge of history. It's easy for me to sit at my typewriter and say, hey, maybe this is a good attack on Winston. Or maybe, maybe Jackie deserves all of this. Or maybe Lloyd George was just an absolute fool. But you've got to be in the shoes. You've got to be in the position of these guys at the time. It's easy afterwards. As the great Arthur Martyr said, and he quotes Homer, after the event, any fool can be wise. One more question.
Barry Fisher and his love of technology and his support of the submarines. We hear very little about the British submarine fleet in the First World War, even the Second World War. But you mentioned the use of coastal defense. Was there any use of the submarines for more offensive or aggressive action? And how much was the submarine service influenced by this, the attitudes of these surface fleet people? Was there a cultural difference there as well that prevented them from being used as much as they could?
Oh yes. Let's deal with the second part first. There was a great difference of opinion between those people who were submariners and those who were surface ship executive officers. Of course there was. There was a whole separate educational establishment for U-boat commanders. These were the ones who were the experimental naval officers. They had lots of enlistments. The Navy was never short for people, but it was a different kind of culture. And the same is true with naval aviation. There was a big gap between those who were naval aviation types and those who were gunnery officers. And gunnery officers and navigators were the key to the efficient running of the surface ships. So yeah, these were experimental. As to actual defensive use by British submarines against German attack, I think the mine is the more effective defensive mechanism than the U-boats were. It's interesting that although the submarine is sold to the British cabinet and to the British public as a means of defense against a German invasion, as Sir John French had proposed, in point of fact, it's Tyrwhitt and Keyes who engaged in their operations on the coast of Germany and Belgium that show the offensive capacity of the submarine. And it's on that score that the value of the submarine in British hands begins to rise. As I said, the Brits had more submarines than the Germans did at the outbreak of the war. They had 75 as a comparison to 29. So that's a great advantage. But the real focus was always on the battle at sea. And since the Germans didn't come to loiter and to invade, they would come to raid and destroy or send their Zeppelins over and terrorize the populace. There was never any need for those people who were based at Harwich to engage in operations against German shipping. So they mined the Dover Straits, sent a barrage in there, fortified the shore. Admiral Bacon was involved in that closing the gap. This forced the Germans to go around the north side of the British Isles, which they did very handily. And so when we get to the Lusitania story, we know that the commander, Schweiger, goes all the way around the north end of the islands and through the Irish Sea, makes a lot of kills before he comes across the Lusitania. And incidentally, Winston and Jackie would take no blame for that. Richard Webb, who is a captain of the Royal Navy, was put in charge of the information. The Brits were always good at the developing ministries of information. Do you follow? You follow? This Ministry of Information was of the opinion, that this was the culpability of the White Star Line, the Cunard Line was to blame, and that the stupid captain, Captain Turner, had put the ship in harm's way by taking a signal off the light off of Cork, and it was his fault, don't you know? In that operation, instructions were sent to take a British cruiser off the patch at the south end of Land's End, Cork. Take it out of there for fear it might be attacked by a U-boat. I'll leave that with you to think about. That's courage under fire, isn't it? Thank you very much.